And we're going to start this long table, which is about representation in Screendance, which we've talked a lot about in various ways so far, but I think now is the time to sort of kind of really directly ask some questions about representation and to listen to our first table setting, first participants of the table setting. And then please remember, the only way that or the long table works is if people come down and replace other people and take a seat at the table so that we can hear everybody speaking. We'll clean up the chairs a little bit so that there'll be waiting spaces down here, which is a little bit more closely the way that we should be doing a long table. But I'm going to ask right now Kara Hagan, Gabi Krista, Li Xiaoping, Omari Motion Carter, Santia. I'm sorry, Santia, I'm not going to try to say your last name because I just will wreck it. And Sylvina Sperling is going to join us on Zoom, I believe. Yeah. Okay, so if we can take a minute to set the table here, and then really, if you want to participate, maybe come down even more close to the table. That would be great. Well, welcome, Sylvina. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's get started. So we have heard, I think, there's both an undertone and an overtone of representation and the lack of thereof, and the problems that we, the problems around representation generally in all different ways. We've been hearing that, I think, during the last few days. So I want to just sort of throw out an initial question, and you can take the question or leave it, speak to it or not. But I think we take the term representation for granted. It's sort of a shorthand for something. Maybe you're not totally sure what that means exactly. So maybe we should just start with the sort of the terminology that we use to speak about generally who we see, why we see, how we see people on screen. So let's talk about the sort of the most basic thing, which is sort of the terminology around representation in this field, in our field. Okay? Okay, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello. Okay. I'm going to sort of answer it and then sorry, I just have such a hard time following the rules. And then go on about what I was thinking and sort of bringing that to us. In the most immediate, and we all know, representation is just seeing yourself either on screen, behind screen, or a reflection of yourself in the room. When I started Screendance, and my first film was 20 years ago, and I started it with Evan Siebens, I literally was the only person of color in the room. And the film was the only one who had people of color in the film. And that is just 20 years ago, so this is great. And so that made me really aware. And it was kind of shocking. What I went back to thinking about the things Robin said, as Lee said, and you know what I've heard, is also thinking about, okay, what does it mean for me? Thinking about what I was saying before about International Journal of Screendance and unpacking that a little bit and said, oh, I feel intimidated by that. I was thinking that representation, and to get representation, means getting an invitation. And not say, oh, just come, because I did that. Or, oh, just come, because we are open. Because the feeling that you can belong in the room and be authentically yourself is not as clear that you might think, even looking at me now, I'm sort of in the places that are occupied or where I have some level of power and agency. That just didn't happen overnight. Everywhere I've been represented, let's say, as a Screendance filmmaker, I'm going to just keep it specifically to that, is by invitation. And then I stepped in. I am here because Doug invited me. I would have not just say, oh, I'm going to that. Doug opened, made space, and then do I feel I belong? I do. but it wouldn't be necessarily that I would have done that. I want to make that really clear. I'm not an insecure person, but I don't automatically think I belong. So that has to go with representation. Meeting Cara and everybody else also. I don't go, oh, I'm going to write for the journal. I've published a few things in Caribbean Dance from Abequat to Zouk is because Susanna Sloot invited me, and I said, I don't know if I can do that. English is my third language. I have a real language thing. So people say, oh, just publish. It's not easy. It take a long time. I have to translate it in my head. I can show you what I wrote 20 years ago, and it's like elementary English. So that's a thing. So there's the invitation. It's really actively seeking. I'm at Barnard College because, and I'm still until next year the only person of color, Black woman, in permanent faculty at Barnard College. Let that sink in, 2022. Okay? But I'm there because I was invited to apply. I said no, I didn't do it, and then I said I did it. So I just wanted to think about, if we talk about representation, then I think, okay, you also put us here because you're interested in including, but I don't want you to miss that an invitation is important. That you say that you're going to feel safe and that you're going to not other me, us, that you listen to what we say when we say something that we feel, and you might not think that that's how I would feel, because it's like, like that's why I wanted to give that example back, reputation and invitation. And then, yes, you feel like you belong and you find your space, instead of just operating and making things happen in your own space and meeting other people. Is it amazing to have this representation here and meeting people? Yes, it's important. It's important to meet Robin. Hopefully come down later, Robin. Yeah, so I want to just frame it that differently.
Thank you, Catherine. Like you started, meaning and interpretation of representation is non-uniform. So I kind of want to start with thinking, what does representation actually do for us? And I think one of the things is it informs us, it gives us some of that knowledge. It also adds or influences our perception. But that means that it also has the potential to obscure, also has the potential to fragment. And then what does it then mean for us to do? What can we be mindful of when we create, when we watch Screendance? I think that's where my thinking is to your question. What are the many ways in which we need to stand in? What does it do internally and externally? What are we trying to represent? What do we talk inside? Like when I say internal, I'm thinking both of Elsie's movie from yesterday, where there was that internal community conversation, but also, inside the brain, the neural networks, the different influences that have made us who we are today, but also the external, how we present ourselves, how we take in the world, and what do we want to say to the world. So that's another part of that piece that I'm thinking about as far as representation goes, and I really would love for everyone to share what they are thinking as well. I think that another thing that stood out for me from yesterday that's still in my mind is Meredith, as well as Whaley's Screendance movies, where Whaley talked about the span. here, ban ethnicity. Yep. and the divide between race and immigration. And it seemed, I hadn't thought so much about it until yesterday when I realized, oh, there are two almost separate streams right there. When in my head it was, oh, race and immigration are all just one big thing, and they're not. So that's another part of what is working in my head right now as I'm thinking about this. I also loved what Meredith had to say. It resonated a lot with personally what I am trying to do in my own artistic performance or practice as a Bharatanatyam dancer. It had always been about rhythm, about choreography, about rehearsing and presenting that perfect frame. But now for me, it seems all more about slowing down, about the intensity and the presence of every movement. And that's what I'm leaning into. I'm also leaning into creating in nature, and not choreographing. I still love the narratives. I still love the stories, the characters that I grew up with. But I'm thinking that now that I've absorbed a lot of that character, if I am going to present that character, what am I representing? Am I going to choreograph everything, every story that is there about the character, or am I going to just allow something to emerge? And what I am doing now is just not choreographing, not rehearsing, and just going and recording myself with whatever emerges about a character. And I'm loving that part of me. So that is another aspect of representation of myself that I'm thinking about. So there are a lot of things out there. Here you go.
Wow, okay. Yeah, I remember like first getting into the London Contemporary Dance School on the master's program, and we had this kind of an induction day, and it was all the BAs and all the master students, and I could count on one hand all the people of color in the room. And so I was thinking to myself, okay, I'm in this space, I need to represent, right? So I was thinking to myself, right, I need to make some black work, I need to come in and just be black and do all of these things. And I wasn't really sure what that was because I've never been in a position of thinking in that way. And even like, I was reading and, Alvin Ailey was saying, the term black dance came from white writers. Like it wasn't necessarily a term. And he was like, well, I'm just dancing, And it was kind of when, so I was speaking to one of my friends who's in the West End at the moment, Obioma Ugola. And he was saying, Amari, it doesn't matter what work you make, it's going to be seen as black, right? Mm-hmm. So you might as well just make the work that you want to make. And so that changed my whole viewpoint of what I was potentially here to do. Let me just make the work I want to make, and I'm going to be represented regardless, So yeah, it's one of those interesting things that I think, okay, yeah, I'm in this space. Just by being in this space is representing. So let me just do me, whether that is black or otherwise. But yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
So I had the unusual privilege to grow up dancing in a studio that was owned by a Black woman, and I danced with other Black and brown girls growing up. And I didn't know until I got to college and I started the conservatory journey that was like not normal at all, and that the ways that I had been taught to celebrate my body were not ways that I was allowed to celebrate my body when I got to conservatory. I can count so many times, that cliche that you'd be rich if you got a nickel for every time somebody said, you should audition for Alvin Ailey. People said that a lot. At any rate, when I got to start practicing Screendance, which was pretty soon after I left college, I made my first film in 2007, and I was super naive. Like, I'd been through this entire colonization of my body in this conservatory environment where I was studying modern and ballet and trying to be a professional. So like giving up things that I loved, like tap dance. I didn't tap for 10 years because people told me that it was like, oh, well, you want to be a professional dancer, you shouldn't tap dance. Don't do that. And so I didn't for a long time, and I picked it up again as an adult. And then coming into this community of screen dance makers and just really not seeing myself. And when I started my festival, I had no idea that there were no other Black women of color at all doing festivals. Robin came along pretty shortly after my festival. Gabri came along. Like, I met women who were doing these things, but when I started, I didn't know them. I did not know that I was the only one. I only learned that when I started writing my book and was like trying to find people, and I was like, oh shit, that's me. So that was super weird, but also really telling, right? And then if we think about the things that show up on screen, those of you who know me well know that I've written and talked about this idea of visual politics and how patterns that we see in screen dance speak to values that we hold collectively, but that may not be held by individuals within the community. And using my festival as a platform for research and getting pushback from other festival directors, asking them if I could do the same data-driven research for their festivals for free. Like, hey, I'm gonna sit here and do this for like 20 hours for you. Can I do that? And people were like, no, we might not get as many submissions if people know that you're like looking at our films with this critical eye. And, you know, it signaled that there was a fear there of looking at ourselves as a community. And certainly not to villainize anyone. I understand where people were coming from with those sentiments, but it was also really frustrating in that there were people who have tried to undermine the work that I've been doing. Well, did you talk to each of the filmmakers? Well, no, how could I? There are literally hundreds of films. So no, I'm watching the films, and everything is online, like social media, artist websites. People generally identify themselves, and you can learn a lot from what people write about themselves in their biographies, the pictures that they post, the places that they show up, with whom they show up with. I mean, this is not hard, right? But this idea that because there was an element of separation, that the work was not valid, is not valid, but how could there not be that separation, right? Like, in all of my experiences of dancing from the age of 17 to now, there has been necessarily separation that I do not create and do not always want, but it is always there. And so to bring that separation into view in my work, I don't think that it can be any other way. I don't know. And so then just a little bit too about philosophically where I'm coming from, having come from where I've come from, having had the early experiences that I had, and thinking about some of the thinkers that were not necessarily engaging in this field as much. Somebody brought, I think it was you, Katrina, yesterday at the long table about, is screen dance feminist? And that's actually something that I've taken up in the book somewhat as well, asking, okay, so maybe it's feminized because there are a lot of women in the practice, female identified folks, but is it feminist? Absolutely not. I think one of the biggest things for me that this comes out in is when we have images on screen that are supposed to be the epitome of beauty. For example, when we have nudity in screen dance. And I will tell you that 2022 is the first year that I have had frontal nudity of a Black female body in submissions. And I've been doing this for 13 years. To have a Black body presented as beautiful enough to be unclothed, to have a fat body presented as beautiful enough to be unclothed, to have a trans body presented as beautiful enough to be unclothed, somebody whose spine does not move straight to be beautiful enough to be unclothed. Right? And we have this thing in the arts again and again and again, where we're like, oh, we just want to see beauty. Example, take off your clothes. Here's this beautiful body. Well, yeah, but like, here are these other beautiful bodies and they're never presented that way. So what is that about? Okay.
Not sure how to follow that. I guess my thought is to get personal here. As one of the older folks up on the panel, it's really nice to see how things have changed. And I think that that's what I'm hearing. And I feel like when I started out being a first generation Chinese American, I did not see myself represented. So the messages that I was brought up with were to erase myself, to become more invisible, to assimilate, and it's really actually a more recent, I would really say a much more recent phenomenon for myself, a discovery and a sort of a reclamation of identity. And it's funny, right? Because here I am a professor in this department, but I am also the first person of color in a tenure track position in this department. So when you look at progress being made, it's not, it is within these last 10 so years. So I resonate with a lot of the things that has already been shared, and am excited, to that things have changed. So, yeah, or in changing.
Muchas gracias por haberme invitado a este simposio y a esta long table. Solo unos minutos para que por ahí sientan lo que se siente cuando no se habla la misma lengua materna. So now I'll switch into English because it will be too weird to go on and on and on. But basically, I am putting forward the thing about language, and as some of you have mentioned, I consider myself English fluent, but of course there's still that barrier. There's the geographic barriers as well, and the political barriers. But now I would like to go into some thoughts that I had yesterday, and it has to do with Doug's question about the word representation. So maybe many of you don't know me. My name is Silvina Sperling, and I like very much that this table is going so personal. I was afraid that I'm the only, I think, Latin American in the room, but I mean, I don't consider myself a woman of color. But of course, what's that, right? Because nobody's skin is black or white, or well, maybe brown is more real name for a skin, but skin is skin colored. I mean, there's no really colors to skin. So moving forward with that, we have to talk about culture, ancestors, land, even weather, etc., and of course language. So I wanted to mention that I don't want to be represented, and I don't want to be representing per se my people, right? Because even though I think I have to mention the networks that I've been working with for Screendance in the last 20 years, that it's the Red Iberoamericana de Videodanza, Ibero-American Video Dance Network, and very recently the CAV, Circuito Argentino de Videodanza, Argentine Circuit of Video Dance, because we haven't jumped into the Screendance term translation yet, and I think we won't because it doesn't translate into Spanish. So when we talk about representation, I think we're talking like as the House of Representatives, that is to delegate power onto other hands. And I think we don't want that. We don't want to delegate. I mean, we have to delegate sometimes. most of the time actually, how to delegate our power, and delegating that power, we're giving away all the complexities that are our own persona and our own body and all our heritage, cultural heritage, physical heritage has. So like as Omari has said, well, anything that I do is going to be Black men dancing, right? But that will be a very simple way of reading that, right? Because each person has their own history, etc. So, but that being said, I want to just take 1 minute to tell you a story that happened to me, not a story, something that happened to me a few days ago, that I met a friend of mine who is from Paraguay, and his mother tongue is Guarani, right? And I am studying Guarani. I'm taking class in Guarani. So I told him, Rodolfo, now I'm taking a class on Guarani. How awesome, how cool is that? And he was kind of mad at me because he was like, what? That is cultural appropriation. That was his words. And we're quite friends, we're quite close friends. And I was like, well, I'm only doing it because I'm interested and I have some history and some people, and I know many people who speak, and I would like to be able to speak. So anyway, then he told me he was kind of teasing me, but I think there's always this tension, which what do you have right to represent, or I would rather present myself than feeling represented or represent others. I think that's what I want to say. And also one more thing, that I love long tables. I participated in a couple of them, but I like more the circle. So I hope soon I can be in the same room in a circle with all of you. And nice to see you, Chopin. Thank you.
Well, shall we continue? Thank you. Just want to comment also on Cara. I did grow up, born and raised in Curacao, Dutch Caribbean, so I actually grew up with all kinds of brown, red people and filmmakers. I started this, I never told this story, but then I started working with Felix Leroy and Norman de Palm, look up their work, first people making films on the island, a gay Black couple who took me under their wings when I was 13. So I've definitely been around artists and also my dad. So I feel very fortunate to have had that experience. And so my shock of being other only came really on a deep level, moving to the Netherlands, where I consider myself Dutch because it's my first language. In Curaçao we speak Papiamento, which is my second language. But at home, because both my parents are not from Curaçao, we spoke Dutch. So I felt, oh, go to the Netherlands, and I really fit in, and it was just a language like, oh, your Dutch is so great. And so, yes, you're being yourself, but also, as Omari said, you're gonna be judged by, you know, how you look no matter what. And especially on screen and when you're represented. So that's, yeah, I was thinking about that, and what does it mean to everybody to see the world reflected, not just small work, but see the world reflected. And this is, I mean, I'm talking right about now on screen. What does it do for your practice? What does it do if you have to overcome your feeling other to just say, oh, I'm gonna just be myself. But I do want to point out that for most white people, you don't have to think about that. You think about your artistic inquiry, which I do too, but I'm still being looked at or ask question about how you look. And so, that's the delicate balance. Last night I saw Rabbit Proof Fence. Have you seen that? It's a movie, it's on YouTube free, and they had lesson plans also. It was interesting, so I watched all the lesson plans about the stolen generation from the Australians. The half Aboriginals were taken from their families, over 100,000 of them, kind of like what happened in Canada and the United States, so that over time they could become more white. So the assimilation is really deep of the superiority of white culture in our upbringing too. Papiamento was a language that was forbidden when I was in school, to speak in school. I had, so there's a lot of colonial history that is deep, and that was actually really interesting how they talk because Australia has had a white-only procedure for a long time, how to think about that. So there was something in that. I started making notes and I forgot my computer on the computer, but yeah. What does it mean to take up space? And what do you overcome to then just make it work is sort of the question I'm putting to everybody here. Because there's a process. I do think there's a process. It's not just like, oh, I'm just gonna do it. There is part of that.
It's an interesting question. I also think it's a big question.
Sorry.
But for me, I studied in what is called English medium. So I speak 7 Indian languages and write and read and all of them, but I studied in English. So I studied all my subjects in English. And even then, I find myself thinking in my primary language. And I have to translate every time I write. And many of my sentences in English are long and circular, and they sound as if they are in my native language, which is Tamil. And the way I put the adjectives together, that's kind of like that too. So even though I studied in English, I still have that. Like when you talked about writing, I was thinking that, well, in some way, that's something that I try to work constantly towards when I'm writing. I'm also new to humanities writing. I trained in science. I'm a biologist by training. I don't work in the field anymore, but that's another thing that I don't hear or see as much as I would love to. When you look inside the body, I particularly looked at neurons, at synapses for a long time. It is just so beautiful, just so beautiful. It's a whole another world. And every human being, regardless of skin color, that's what we have. Come on, people. I mean, let's just celebrate this. This is just gorgeous. So that's what I think. When I see people, I'm like, wow. But I don't hear that said as much as I would like to hear. So I'm seeing it.
So something that I've been thinking and wondering about a lot is how we talk about and validate Screendance that may show up in spaces that are not like this one, where you may have students who have not been, in an educational context, exposed to a space like this or work like the work that folks in this room are making, but they are making TikToks every day, right? And with dance styles that we don't generally see on the festival circuit specifically. And I'm coming from an American context, so when I say styles that I'm not seeing as an American dancer, I'm not seeing tap dance, I'm not seeing hip hop, I'm not seeing jukin, I'm not seeing krump. not in the submissions that are coming to us. Yes, there's more than there were, but still the primacy of postmodern dance, like, is the upper echelon of what it means to create a screen dance, even though, and this goes back to some of the talk that we had the first day, and Harmony, where are you? You're up there, hi. About the unspoken histories and influences of dancers and makers of color on white makers like Maya Deren, right? I am in this space where I really want to challenge our canon and thinking about even stuff that we can't even see today, right? Things that just don't exist anymore. There's a film, I can't remember what the name of it is, it doesn't exist anymore because it was made in like 1910 or something and it's gone. But it had a lot of really famous vaudeville and minstrel performers in it, and there was an entire company cakewalk in this film, right? And cakewalk is an American art form, unequivocally. And what would it mean, even if we cannot see that film, if we were to talk about it? There's this really lovely cartoon where Cab Calloway is rotoscoped to be Coco the Clown. And it's like a little animation horror film. I don't know, y'all who know me know that I love horror. I love my horror. What can I say? But this is an incredible dance film. It's animated. It's got Cab Calloway's actual body in it, in the body of this animated clown. Like, this is before they had Savion Glover doing Happy Feet, right? Like, so thinking of the ways that we're talking about the form, talking about who is making, and even things that may seem indirect, but have had a larger impact than we may know on what it is we're seeing and what it is we're making. And I know that some people in this room have been also tracking, again, Harmony digital histories, where you're getting things like worldwide simultaneous dance in 1998, I think it was, where you had, this was before Zoom, so this was like a huge deal, right? Where people are zooming in from different parts of the world doing different kinds of dance all together at the same time. And thinking about satellite projects where people have been using NASA satellites to bring people together on screen, superimposed one next to the other, right? And I think sometimes we leave this stuff out because it's not easy pickings. Like, we have to go into other disciplines to find these histories, these stories, these projects. And there's part of me that feels like Screendance, even though it says, well, we're really interdisciplinary, has not completely grasped the depth of that interdisciplinarity in terms of its history, you know? But I'm also gonna get up because I feel like some other people should be down here. Okay.
I was just reflecting on how weird it is to be on screen and you are all present. And I'm not sure that my ideas are getting through. But I have to say that with all these 20 years of exchanging with colleagues and curators from, especially from all of Latin America, and experienced the multiplicity of I would say, of tones or of experiences, that even though there's a lot of sharing regarding political instability, economic crisis, a lot of migration in and out and through and etc. There are so many diverse and different life experiences, and that brings a different way of producing art and Screendance, of course, as well, and also a lot of collaborative spirit. I don't want to speak in general because it might be contradictory to to what I said before, but I think we're all the time trying to be more collaborative and more cooperative and use solidarity with one another and to help in specific moments like coup d'etats or any right-wing clown almost dictator coming on power, and that happens to us a lot. So we've been practicing this collaboration, and it does include curatorial collaborative practices and artistic collaborative practices, and that has go ahead for some decades now. So I think we're really building a field where we kind of feel we don't really need the Northern Hemisphere somehow. I don't know. It doesn't sound nice. It doesn't sound nice, but it used to be that we were like looking up all the time, like saying, oh, what's going on in the real world, right? The first world was even, but the third world, I don't know if it does exist at all, but it does work as a huge field of collaboration. And that is what is more important, to be able to look at each other and be able to talk to each other without needing the other person to be the same as you are, right? But of course, there's social tension and there's ethnic tension and there's tension all the time and there's ideological tensions. But so we try to stay together so we can build our own field, right? With publications and with works and with. But of course, I'd love to be more to have more exchange with you, who are my older pals. Thank you.
I was just going to ask a question because it was actually came from something that Kara said yesterday, I think, and I just wonder about about economics a little bit, about capitalism, and I was wondering about when it's kind of like, sort of poor neighborhoods that get fixed up and gentrified, and then they get pushed out. I was kind of almost putting that on this a little bit, thinking that it's wonderful how Kara and Gabri and a whole bunch of people have been able to be in positions of curating festivals now, that they have some voice, some ability to do that. But I wonder also something that you had said yesterday about these grants in New York City Ballet, now competing for the same grants. And I wondered about how long it would be before that power would be taken away. I wondered when, because of economics, because something was now at stake where others might come back and take that for themselves, the space that was there might evaporate.
Yeah, we really do have to talk about capitalism and colonialism. I'm gonna get away from the table, but I was also reading abolitionist practices for the university last night. I would like to share that later. And I also want to put in highbrow, lowbrow entertainment, art, and how when we talk about this, because there's representation on screen and popular everything people. So what are we really talking about, and why is there we are better than because we make art moment? Just questioning that.
Just for a second, before you, I want to just throw a couple things out. If people want to pick it up, fine. If they don't, fine. But I was listening earlier, or I've been listening the whole time. But Karen mentioned something about expanding the canon, which kind of caught my ear. And I'll just say a couple things, and again, pick them up or go. something about the idea of vernacular forms. So what's represented in Screendance is often gets to us by curators in some way. So Chumping and I have talked about this a lot. So for instance, I know Chumping grew up looking at Kung Fu movies. I'm sure, Sandeep and I have talked about Hollywood and Bollywood. I heard Cap Calloway mentioned. I was thinking about the Nicholas Brothers, which I grew up with, those kind of movies, where Yiddish, vernacular dance, and other forms of sort of related diaspora dance or flamenco. So if anybody wants to pick that up about how sort of vernacular forms of dance that we don't see in the Screendance world as a topic, I want to throw that out. Go ahead.
Okay, so my thought sort of connects with that idea, but it really comes from what Amari was saying earlier about this tokenism that we have in the arts. So my perspective is slightly different. I come from narrative film instead of screen dance, but there seems to be a quota or box when it comes to genres of film. So if your film is not, speaking from my own identity, Black enough, then I don't know if I can program that film. And there's so many complexities, and just connecting with what Sylvia is saying, is that there is no monolith on identities, but it feels like in the arts there are these boxes that we uphold and we keep because of A, capitalism, money, to draw people, and then two, comfortability. If I don't understand your identity, therefore, I don't understand your identity, I can't program it because it's outside of my immediate experience. And that perpetuates this idea of like, well, only, again, from my identity, only this Black person can succeed in this genre of art, from my perspective. And so there becomes this roadblock for those who want to venture into screen dance. I don't know if it will be accepted. The reason I'm here is because of Charlotte. And I didn't know about screen dance film prior to this. We talked about it in undergraduate program, but prior to that, I don't know if this is a field for me. So, I mean, that connects to a larger idea, specifically for minorities, how art is not upheld as a valid career, and is not appreciated by other minorities as well as other races to say your work is valid. So from a narrative perspective in my graduate program, it becomes challenging to stay with it because you don't feel that your work will be appreciated. And there's an argument about feeling and truth and all of that, but I think there should also be some type of intention on how can we make people feel like their work is valid. So it taps into a little bit of your question, but going back to earlier what we were talking about.
Yeah, I'll add to that really quickly before I leave the table as well. But yeah, I was speaking to Gita about the Arts Council in England and the kind of funding structures that we have and the things that they ask for. And a lot of the time they want it to be cutting edge, talking about relevant issues, right, in the world, right? So what happens is that you get all these artists talking about issues. And so what I found was that there were so many angry Black bodies on screen, especially with hip hop dance, a lot of attacking, and hip hop bridges the gap between revolt and reform. And what's happening is that there's so much revolt. And so for me, it was like, how can I balance that and what we're seeing? So I tend to make a lot of pieces about joy and those sorts of things and thinking like, oh, maybe joy is something that's transgressive. That's my little pocket of activism. Because activism doesn't always mean revolting against something. It can also just be reforming or breaking away from the monolith. So, yeah.
That's totally right on, man. Like, it's such again, going back to these binaries that we have in art and culture in general, it's just first these ideas of like, well, you have to be the next, from my end, like, Barry Jenkins, and and if you're not like him, then we can't give you funding because we only know this type of story, even, which is odd to me because he just created a film. His work is relatively new to the zeitgeist, comparison to like Spike Lee and other, Black creatives, but you have this pressure on you as a creative Black artist to create something that represents your whole community, which is, I don't know the experience of other races or genders, but it's like I don't want to create sometimes because I'm not representing my community in all this vastness. And I think that's unfair for art programs to put that on minorities, to say you need to create something. And it's not as like blatant and bombastic as that, but it's subtle in the way that it's like, well, what's going on in your community right now? And it's like, well, there's a lot of things going on in my community. There's injustices, there's joy, there is, still reckoning with racism, blah, 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 but sometimes it feels like you're being pigeonholed to find some type of success in that field by going with, a lack of a better phrase, like trauma porn.
So I also come from working in commercial narrative film, and I think what's interesting is when you're working in dance on film, you are working in film, and your audiences are coming with cultural narratives, stories, styles from film, because pretty much everybody will have watched a film, they'll have watched TV. Not everybody will have gone and seen a contemporary dance performance or any kind of dance performance. Most people will have danced socially at some point in their life. So there's a tension here between this very specific world and the kind of wider world that it exists within. And you're seeing all these tensions that you guys are talking about in commercial film. I always think of Weber, and he talked about this in relation to capitalism. He talks about an iron cage versus a cloak that you can slip off. I think the danger sometimes for immutable identities that are put on people is when they become an iron cage that you can never step out of. So as a Black filmmaker, you're only allowed to make films that are Black in some way. And who defines that? A. B, that means you're boxed in. What I see happening, and this is just something I think we have to reckon with, all of us. I was writing, so I write horror, if you're interested, and I specifically write a lot of dance horror, so. So I was writing, so I'm a narrative screenwriter as well as a choreographer, and I was writing a dance horror screenplay set in Chicago. And originally my main protagonist was, set in high school, that age as well, was an African-American boy. And I was told in very clear, no uncertain terms by all the producers that I spoke with that I was not allowed to write that story, which I get on the one hand. So I didn't. But on the other hand, I'm thinking that would have been a great part. It was dance, character, it would have been a great, interesting part to play for a dancer/actor, someone local. So on the one hand, I feel like it's a shame that that opportunity's been taken away. It's also a shame that we are not encouraging ourselves to really experience what true empathy feels like, from doing our absolute best to step into someone else's shoes. And as makers and writers and creators, that's always what we're doing. And if we're saying that as human beings, we're not capable of doing that, that the only way is by having the lived experience, then we're siloing ourselves into a whole series of corners of which we cannot even shout across at other people. I think there's something desperately, existentially tragic and sad about that. So how do we move out of that is my question. Because I feel like we're circling the drain.
Yes. Yes, really.
Hello there. You go first. I'll go first.
speaking to what was just said about seeing people who are not like you through your own lens, or being seen through someone else's lens who's not like you. Like, for example, if I think about some of the data that I've taken, and knowing that a majority of the Black films that have come in that feature Black bodies have been directed by white directors, I think and Brenda Dixon Gutschchild talks to this in a really beautiful way in much of her work, but there's something to be said for being able to choose to feature bodies that are not like you, and to not have that choice. As in, I've made 2 screen dances at the University of Akron on students. I do not have any students of color in my casts. I do not have any disabled students in those casts. I didn't get to choose that cast, right? And so often, especially when you're working with partner organizations, like I do a lot, you don't get to choose. Whereas when it might be, and I think your idea of being able to have that part is wonderful, because it sounds like, okay, yeah, that would have been a great part for an actress of color who would have really thrived in that particular role. At the same time, it's that question of tokenism again, where you can say, okay, well, I've got this really wonderful part for a person of color, and then being a person of color and going, gosh, I have this part that I'd like to write for a person of color, but I can't seem to find anyone, right? In the communities that you may be a part of. And so that is something that I think needs to be dealt with. I don't know how, because I don't know how to change the structure of universities. I don't know how to change the structure of, dance studios and places where I find myself making work with other people in a collaborative way. And yes, I do have some power over the things that I make as an individual artist, where I'm not connected to anyone at all, but then the economics piece comes in. I mean, a lot of us do collaborative work because there's money there, and we can do it, yeah? And so, yeah, I'm just putting that out there as something to think about.
Thank you. I have a kind of a follow-up on it. So I'm going to talk about my festival, Moving Body, Moving Image. I sent you the review. Did you got it?
Thank you.
Yeah, this morning. So one of the things I do, and even when I select films and make films, is that if there is a film with only white makers about a Black film, it will not pass, no matter how good it is, period. If there is no ownership at one point. That doesn't mean that it could be a white screenwriter writing about, but then there has to be a producer and a director, or would at least be people of color representing who is on stage. And then the person on screen has to have that agency. That's looking at the film itself. Then my jury selection represents who is it. Gets very difficult. So in the first one was a brown body, which now we did BIPOC body. So the jury, so a lot of the films didn't make it because there were a lot of films about Black people by only white cast and nobody had ownership, didn't pass. Because there is a part of telling the story that is important. That doesn't mean that you couldn't do it, but if you're not working with, then no. Because that is not really done in Black story, right? Or in the sense that is that not that representative. So there is the ownership part in part of it, not just who writes it. So there are ways out of it if you collaborate with other people, for example. Then the jury is that too. So the first one was like Asian, Black, me, to select those films. So a lot of films, the selection gets smaller. The second one was the aging body. But then all of a sudden, we had a lot of aging white films, and that couldn't happen too, because not all of a sudden I'm gonna leave out the BIPOC body. Then looking at films where the aging person, and then a lot of it were 60 and up, would also have to have agency in that, was also hard. And then, so on the level of ownership and really make it truly about aging, is that that it could not be a film about that. Now, I didn't just learn that, but also in the jury I had 2 people 70 and up. And some films made it, including in the one I just had, because they said, no, this is a really valid film. Or I had a film that I liked, but it was a young woman dancing around a person who was just sitting on a chair as an older person. So once it passed all those things, like there was an older person in the film, then the jury was like, no way. But then the jury had to be people of color, aging, and everything else. And now we just did a disability and we had the same things. And then I'm like committed, 100% committed, that if it's about people with disability, that the people with disability had a say as a maker, as in Katarina's work, or had to be having ownership as a director, as a producer, as a screenwriter, as a choreographer, or have been collaborating in how they are presented on screen to make that. You can imagine that it got slimmer pickings, because then also it had to be intergenerational in my jury. It had to be different representations of people and people with disabilities. And yes, that happened. So I had films in there that I would not have picked, because every time I learn again from the two people on there, and one is in Pioneers Winter Film, she's pretty severely disabled, but there were films that she insisted were important to be seen from her perspective. So anyway, the ownership on all levels is so important, I believe.
Oh, this is getting good. Especially when the idea of writing or collaborating with a perspective that is not your own. And I think it goes back to your point about empathy. What I found in collaboration with those who want to create stories that are not of their own perspective identity, there's a difference between empathy and fetishism. And I think people don't want to tackle that issue in art because it's like, oh, art is open to everyone and blah, 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 blah. But there is a difference from understanding a person's life, their journey, and getting to what Sylvia was saying, that individual perspective, in contrast with, I'm creating art because I want to take away from that identity in so many ways. So if people are really interested in creating outside of their identity, they have to grapple with that. Why do I want a disabled body in this film, in this project? Is it to understand, to get more empathy for myself, and through this process we can create something that will support that community? Or is it, I'm doing this because I want to, and it's a shame to say that, but but I want to make art so I can get grant money for it. So it makes me look better. And that's really on a personal basis that you have to explore that. I have to do that when I'm creating art that is not out of myself. I'm like, what is your intention with this, George? Is it truly pure here? And it feels like sometimes that those who want to come into the Black experience, and I can only speak from that, it feels like, oh, I just want to take. And that's where the friction comes with, one, wanting to collaborate, and then two, being open to have identities or that are different from ours to come into our space and to collaborate with us. And that comes with like past scars, blah, 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 blah. But I think that's really an issue that we have to tackle in our society, fetishism of different minorities.
Yeah, thank you. I just really was jumping up on the white savior complex, because there is a danger to say, oh, but I'm doing this great thing with great things and I'm giving that, right? And that's a dangerous line in my perspective. And also, it doesn't mean, like, racism runs really deep. I have a very blue-eyed, blonde mother who's married to my dad, of course, and my dad just passed, sorry. But I still talk about him if he's still here. But my mom is super racist on a lot of levels. She says things because, my father is an exception. So don't think exceptionalism is really, like, we have to talk exceptionalism here, people, because, like, we can't represent everybody. Be careful for exceptionalism. Meaning, oh yeah, all those Black men do that, but not your dad. We know that. I know we on the table know this, we're here, yes. And so really, like, the deep thinking I do, like I'm just talking myself, being in another space that has the different complexities, really has to be deep thinking and deep listening. Like I'm just sharing the films that I would not have chosen because I was really aware of my own maybe ableism or anything else. And I had to say, okay, I have these people on the jury, I'm gonna listen to them. So if you have people other than you telling you something, deeply listen, because that's where it really starts. Deeply listen and say, oh, how I'm gonna turn it around if I was, like, put yourself in somebody's shoes to really get that. That's where we're really getting to. And that really requires humility and going away from what I would want as a curator. That makes sense? Okay, I'm gonna go again.
Selena wants to say something from Zoom land. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to relate this talk about minorities and complexities to what was talked the first day about feminism and the female gaze in general. And I think, we cannot avoid the issue that we are Screendance people, but we live in a larger world, right? So, for example, in Argentina, in the last 4 years, there have been a very strong feminist movement. And so in order to mainly to fight for an abortion or pro-choice law, which ultimately we won. So we're happy about that. But in those 3-4 years of fight in the streets with huge demonstrations, so there were also, actresses, women writers. So everyone went with like their own collective, and that added up to these multitudes of women. But I think the most important consequence, I would say, about this very strong movement is that now there's a lot of men, heterosexual men, that were forced to shift, even though a little bit, to more inclusive gaze and to a more flexible way of behaving and accepting. And even we are working a lot about an inclusive language, because I don't know if you know, but Spanish is very binary, like with even adjectives and many other words other than nouns have their own gender. Like table is a female and the sun is a man, etc. So now we're working a lot about inclusive language, and that was very fought against at the beginning, and now it's more and more general, especially in the younger generations. So what I'm saying is that I noticed that of course that subject and that gaze on the female body has also shifted in many of the pieces that we see on stage and on screen, and even not only in Screendance but also in performance art by the visual artists, and that really is a field where you can see change, even if it's small and maybe it's not super relevant in terms of, but also about fighting funding, so there will be equality in the funding, this is a distribution. Of course, it's still early, but I have to say that it does show on screen as well, and that is something that I would like to address, because I think it's relevant. It's really relevant to this discussion as well.
So I have many thoughts and questions. One thing I can offer in terms of ideas of representation, perception, existing identity is sort of my place, which is an in-between line. So I think, Kara, your research would identify me as a white filmmaker. Gabby, your jury would identify me as a white filmmaker. But the United States of America identifies me as non-white. And your research and jury might identify my sister differently because my mother is half Korean. Yeah.
Just want to say the asked out
Ah, okay. That makes, yeah, but I think that is a complicated question, you know, for my whole life, the checking the boxes, and then in checking the boxes, does that elevate me in this job application in a way that is unfair? And then being in academic spaces, many in this country, historically white teaching, white serving spaces, I again am in this strange line where white folks are comfortable enough to be very racist around me, and then when I'm in allyship spaces, I'm sort of the enemy. So, it's just an interesting space to exist in, especially in these conversations. So to move away from that a little bit, like I do think the conversation we're having here about Screendance immediately comes back to dance curriculum and dance programs, especially in higher education. And what Kara was saying is like, it doesn't take that long to revise a curriculum. So which dance practices are we celebrating, and how will that impact the screen dances we're making? I also just want to say, like, in coming to a space like this, you know, and considering the Emerging Perspectives Roundtable and inviting George and Meredith and Whaley, like, you know, it is in my mind when, especially considering the recent high visibility anti-Black and anti-Asian violence and murder in the United States, like, is Wisconsin going to be safe for Whaley and George to come in person? Are they going to be safe and then also comfortable? Like, not knowing that myself. So I just want to acknowledge that there is that question of diversity, inclusion, and just comfort. And like, am I going to really stress out their lives by asking them to come to these spaces? I was intimidated to walk up the stairs to Lathrop Hall, you know, and I have all the unearned privilege of being a white lady, except that's not entirely my home of origin. I am very excited, again, in the ACDA panel, I was talking about cross-listing, co-teaching, collaboration, and I feel a lot of that is the future of this conversation as well. Co-authorship, collaborative creation, just, you know, in community, in and beyond academia. And I do have a question. We've talked about like inviting folks in, and I'm very excited about this, the counter question of that of taking our work out and or just supporting work outside of these spaces. And I'm thinking a bit too about, in the United States of America, we have a whole system of historically Black colleges and universities, and I'm wondering what kind of relationships we can be making with HBCUs at our own home organizations and or communities. Yeah, it's a lot of entanglement.
I'm going to leave, but just before I do, I just want to address Doug's question about vernacular dance and social dance, because, and again, this takes it back to structural issues. So when you look at the copyright law for dance, it deliberately excludes social dance. It excludes TikTok, it excludes those vernacular dances, which, you know, is, again, there are structural things. I mean, that has to be changed legally at Supreme Court level in order, you know, so the emphasis is on concert dance for copyright. So this is an issue a lot in diverse spaces within commercial dance around creators being able to monetize and earn a living from their work on something like TikTok, from their work on YouTube. But because it often is viewed as coming out of social vernacular dance, it's left out of copyright. So, you know, again, it's like looking at what structural changes can be made and addressing some of those massive structural inequities. That's a good example. All right, I'm gonna scoot now. Thank you.
There is a comment from Zoom. This is from Jen Ray, who presented yesterday. She says, I'm very proud and excited to see various Indigenous dance films being seen more recently as well. It's more important to remember diversity also includes economics, environment, etc. A person born into poverty with no familial support will have more obstacles to break into the field than a person born to a family of established artists. Skin color is not the entire story. There are many invisible or less visible ways in which we are diverse. And then from Dominique Revol, who actually is presenting through Zoom later on today, she asks, I'm interested in what ways to create moving images without being representational is a question. And then she did add later on, McDougall writes that, quote, filmmaking is a form of looking before being a form of representation or communication. So, if I can repeat her question, if that helps. It was a lot, sorry.
It sounds like she might be asking about abstraction.
Yeah, that's what I thought of water for Maya, Stan Brakhage. I mean, there's so many ways to approach movement. The moving image doesn't have to include the human form. Yeah, but it looks like we have another response.
So I was just actually thinking a couple of things. The first one is the whole kind of question of language, because Doug asked about vernacular dance, and it reminded me, Amari, of your first comment, because vernacular dance already has power implicated within that term. And so many of the terms with which we use, you know, around representation, disability, highbrow, lowbrow, all of those things have kind of power implicated in them. I was thinking we've invoked Trinity Minha multiple times over the course of this conference, and there's a whole question of, I mean, Trinity really works with representation deeply and questions of visibility and invisibility. And that's something that I, you know, reaching back to those early feminists like Beatrice Spivak, who talks about strategic essentialism. Like, when are the moments as artists where we want to claim certain identities in order to make certain kinds of points? And when are the moments when we perhaps want to complicate, challenge, or refuse those easy identities? I'm thinking about people like Mayfield Brooks's work, who refuses certain kinds of connotations of Blackness, or is constantly questioning at the same time that they are claiming certain moments of connection with that identity. So the ways in which identities can become intentionally complicated, such that moments of representation get fractured rather than the boxes. I hear so many times people talking about boxes, you know, which boxes do we choose? My other comment has to do with, so I think about this a lot as a white critic. I don't want to not write about forms of dance that don't immediately reflect my identity. At the same time, I feel that I can be very thoughtful, hesitant in a good way, and I can study and learn about. Because I'm white doesn't mean I can speak for a Black artist, but it also doesn't mean I have the right to ignore those artists. So how do I approach that work, knowing that I have the power to represent or not? I mean, I thought about this very strongly in my first book, Choreographing Difference, because I wanted to talk about Blondell Cummings. I wanted to talk about Irvin Bushman. I wanted to talk about some of Bill T's work. And yet I knew I wasn't able to talk about them in the same way, but I could educate myself. I could understand and I could think about and read Black critics, Black theorists, and that I wasn't ever pretending to have the whole story, but I also wasn't excusing myself from not having to be responsible for representing. Not that I could totally do that, but I feel as if that's important to have conversations. And I think this whole question of collaboration, of exchange, so that I'm not the only voice, but that I feel that's very strong in, we have a student, or not a student, faculty person working with a group of students who have multiple identities. He's queer Filipino, and he wants them to dance his story also. And so how do you navigate across those kinds of hesitancies and challenges, and yet encourage bodies that aren't like his to actually be willing to dive expressively into his choreography, you know? And these, I think, there are no easy answers at all. But these are questions that, and conversations that are just really important to keep having. But I did want to say, it's important for white writers, white critics, white filmmakers, screenmakers, not to assume it's all hands off because I can't know, but to actually study, look at, talk about, engage with deeply. All of that work, yeah. So it's a tricky, you know, you use that in between, that liminal space. Critically, I feel like it's a very liminal space. It's a scary space, but it's a space where I try to navigate the willingness to imagine I have something worthwhile to say about someone like Mayfield Brooks, because I've been studying their work for a long time and I feel that it touches me deeply, and yet not wanting to be the only word on Mayfield Brooks. Yep. But also not stepping back and going, well, somebody else should write about that. Someone who is Black should write about that. Because there's a lot of other stuff. Mayfield's not just a Black artist. Yes. And so how do I use that sense of connection? Oh, I have goosebumps again. How do I use that sense of connection, but also learning? My learning, I can learn. I can study these forms. I can study where they come from. I can pull that knowledge in and do that work.
I was asking George if he ever uses the term global majority, person of the global majority. Is anyone here engaging with that? Yeah. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. And then I think what you said was important, I think, for all of us, because in the end, we don't want any boxes or want to talk about representation and just all approach work of the other deeply. So thank you for that. And I hope in my own work, I do that, and there's deep listening and deep thinking about whatever the experience is. I feel like, sometimes when I came to the States, I would say, people would say to me, are you black? And I was like, no. What do you mean I'm black? Because I don't come from this history and I didn't understand the white-black thing. But I have a Chinese grandfather, and then I have Jewish ancestor, not long before. My mom is 500 generations at least Dutch white. So I always feel like very global. And then there's the whole African diaspora from my father's side, the sort of the darker one over. And so there is this big complexity in that. And then grappling with how you are still being perceived from the outside as a person of color and all the other things are not in there, right? And I embrace all of them, so it's a very complex identity, and so I've always said global, and in a certain spaces, you would have to say, the boxes are asked from you in pretty much everything censuses, your boxes are asked. So I always try to do Jewish. My great-grandmother was a Levi, a Creole Jew. My grandmother is Ongaswi. I know where in China they come from. There's all those things. So, and the majority of the world is some kind of color of brown person. And so the majority, we're not minorities, right, in that sense. What I'm grappling with, and how it's mostly for me, it's like a global thing, because if you even look back at how many years we've been refugees finding other spaces to live, so I also want to invite everybody to think about how much migration has happened over in the global sense and in the histories for such a long time. And we're having this discussion for me personally because one day I don't want to have this discussion. I can't believe we're still having this discussion, people, seriously, because I've been doing that for 30 years and it's kind of like weird, because I find that I should have sat here with Marisa and with Katrina, because artistically there's a lot there that binds us more than that separates us. So in the end of the day, like that sort of the looking at each other as individuals and then their complex background and then I never actually assume anything about anybody. I would hope to, I dare say that I don't. But then also, there's where the self-identification comes. And I'm rambling a little bit, but I really do think that in the end, maybe what we take away is really thinking more globally and of the centuries of forced or not forced immigration, and then even when we bring it back to the war, and yes, Ukraine, and there is, Haiti, and there's all this others. It's like, how does it affect us when everybody is just starting to change, and how do cultural change? How can Screendance reflect that? And so that maybe we don't have to have this conversation the next time. In 20 years, is it when we're gonna have it? Yeah.
I want to take on Anne's sense of connection, those words. And I want to share that in my own experiences with collaborating with other dance styles, other ethnicities, and also having taught students who are non-Indian, I have found that there's just a huge amount of learning, a huge value and beauty in someone who is in sharing just that art form with someone who is not of the same religion, not the same color, doesn't have the same kind of body, but it's just a beautiful human connection, a human empathy, all the words that we've spoken, joy. And that is, to me, the essence of why I still want to be dancing.
I just wanted to share that.
What's that?
Do one thing, sure.
From this person.
If we can do maybe one Zoom comment, then we're running out of time, so we need to come to a stopping point for the next. 11:30. Oh, I'm sorry. Forget what I just said.
Can we have a 10-minute break before the next? Yeah.
We could end a little early if everyone's okay.
Yeah. I just think it would be nice to have a little break before we go again. That water.
Yeah, how about if we do the internet or the online question and then Ami's setting the table, maybe we can help us end the session.
Okay. Okay, so this is from Caprice in Zoomland. I wonder how Screendance artists deal with issues of intersectionality. That is, that issues of gender, race, and class are relational, especially in social structures. How can Screendance take a more intersectional approach to issues of representation?
Go for it. Go, Amy.
I cannot reply to that question. I was going to offer a different story, but I have help now. Yeah, thank you.
So you reply that.
And then I share my story.
Okay, I'll tackle intersectionality.
Thank you.
It's a really important question. I do feel that, and I think Anne spoke to this a little bit, and also Gabri and others in terms of the box ticking and kind of separating out our identities for very specific purposes. But I think that the question of intersectionality, in other words, that none of us shows up in a space as just one thing, but always as multiple things, always, all the time. But also when we show up in any given space, how those things are read or perceived, or how they operate with or without our consent, that's also part of the picture, part of the experience, part of the story. So I think that the question of intersectionality can be addressed to many things. One of which is what is actually happening on the screen in terms of the stories that are being told, the actual politics of representation, the way as artists, as critics, as directors, as whatever identity or location we happen to inhabit vis-a-vis a particular piece. How we are framing, how we are understanding the bodies that are the people that are appearing on screen in terms of their various social identities. And one of the things that has come up today is indiscernibility, that we might misread, that in fact often we will misread. And so what is the agency of the creator or of the creative team in kind of self-determining, but also recognizing that identity is social, that I can identify in a certain way, but other people have to recognize me, that it goes both ways. And so then it goes back to the relationality and the ethics. And this also invites something that I wanted to bring to the table in terms of this question of representation, because there's a kind of representation that happens when we're engaged in storytelling, and whose stories do we tell, whose stories do we have a right to tell, whose stories are we learning. But there's also representation in terms of like a visual palette, an aestheticization of, in this case, namely skin tone differences, or maybe even movement vocabulary differences, where difference is aestheticized and like that's its function. And I think that's just something to think about. I think we need to think about how that works. There's also representation in terms of we tend to still be obsessed with the idea, the notion of the choreographer, the lone choreographer and the lone director, and people being very specifically in roles. But there are creative teams involved, and so we might have these, huge collaborative teams. How is that labor being made visible? How is that diversity being made visible? Or does that diversity just operate to kind of uphold a certain authorial position of the choreographer, or usually often the director? I think that's something that we need to kind of think about, the identities, the creative work that gets repackaged in the name of the person who gets the first credit line. So I think that's something that we need to think about in terms of representation, whose labor, whose lives, whose labor gets credited. There was another version of representation. Oh yeah, and then of course, like whose labor or experience is invisibilized in that process. And Kara, you were mentioning Cab Calloway, and they're actually, a few to several examples of rotoscoping of Cab Calloway's movement. And it's very interesting because the one that you're referencing is from Old Man of the Mountain, which is a Betty Boop film. And one of the things that's, I think, very interesting is that because Cab Calloway's movement has been rotoscoped, that figure, that character, has a huge amount of mutability. So he appears as Coco the Clown, but also this old man figure, and also a ghost. And so there's that real fungibility of blackness that underlies that, which I think is really interesting, but also the very specific invisibility, the very purposeful invisibility. In other words, the presencing of blackness on screen through its absencing, through its disappearance. So then there's also that kind of representation, that recovery that can kind of recapturing the lost histories, the lost stories as a form of representation. And I think that all of those actually kind of open back onto this question of intersectionality, that even when we're looking at something or we have an image of what it is that we're looking at, what is it that we're not seeing? And can we invite and open up a little bit more to be more expansive, to use some of the language that we've been using, in terms of what it is that, when we see, what is it that we see? And can we see what we don't see? Can we make space for that which we don't see and recognize that what we don't see is also there?
Thank you. It's very scary to finally be here at this table, so I'm going to lie down. I thought somebody needs to do this. And I was thinking that maybe I could represent the silent body who doesn't have a voice. But now I do have a voice, so I'm here, and I'm just trying this position. But in Sweden, I have often been the silent body in space that comes from dance. But it's not about me now. I wanted to talk about Swedish colonialism. And I don't know how much you know about it, but I come from this decolonizing conference where I was asked to do a keynote with a colleague who is a Sami choreographer. So I just wanted to share his story. And it's related to what I listened to, how you were talking about the color of your skin and the way you look and how you get interpreted, and some identities are not visible at all. So my colleague Ola Stinnerbom, he comes from a very powerful Swedish music family. But he was the only one, he was the one in his family who really looked Sami. So he trained at the Swedish ballet school. He was this great dancer. But all his life he felt that people would always ask, are you Asian? Are you Japanese? Who are you? So when he became 30, 40 years old, he started to research the legacy of Sami dance. However, now we have this situation that the Swedish church has really been successful with the oppression of Sami people. So he's the only one now in Sweden who asks to have the Sami dance recognized in Sweden, but his own people turns his back to him. So what I did is that I asked him, maybe you need to read bell hooks, because it's from a different space on Earth, but she's describing the same, I think, that she comes from a very conservative family. She wants to seek for education, and they call her mad, and finally she takes on her ancestor's name to kind of say, okay, so I'm mad, I'm going to be proud of that. And I think that that is what Ola Stinnerbom also has done. And when I was then asked, are you still following me? Yeah. I feel totally mad now, but that's okay. That's my role here now. I'm the mad presenter. Okay, so no, but I thought, you know, maybe it's not really related to Screendance, but what I actually did with our keynote is that I edited our speech to become a film, where I included his dance and I included my dance. I included his family history and I included my family history. And I did that as a kind of non-binary act, because I did not want to be the Swedish, now since 1 year, more institutional, representing a dance academy in the university, which is still very new for me, but kind of share our stories and also beginning with our ancestors. And I have my story, it's Swedish, but it's the similar violence from the Swedish church. So we could meet there and discuss our positions through dance and music. I think that's what I wanted to say. Thank you. And come here and lie down with me if you want to.
I just want to say really quickly, I know we're going to end now, but if it wasn't for the Screendance community, I don't think I would have worked with so many diverse types of people if I was still in the live space. And I'm very thankful for this community, and I always call it a family, you know, I always do. So it's my brothers and sisters, my aunties and uncles, we're all here together, and we lie on this table. This is what it is. This is representation right here. So love to you all. Let's take a break.